Hello and welcome back to the Robert E. Howard Foundation channel. Today we're doing a special video in honor of one of Bob's friends and fellow writers. August 20th is the birthday of H.P. Lovecraft, and we thought we would do a video talking about the relationship between Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, which existed solely through the letters they wrote to each other. Our panel today is making his first appearance on the channel is our double threat Howard and Lovecraft scholar, Bobby Derie. Bobby has written two books, Sex and the Cthulhu Mythos and Weird Tailor's Essay on Robert E. Howard and Others. He's also on the Foundation Board of Directors, and he has a website that goes into Lovecraftiana and related stuff, and his website is deepcuts.blog. I will have that up in the definition or the box for this video. Next, making his return is Dr. Willard Oliver, writer of the new biography on Robert E. Howard, Robert E. Howard, The Life and Times of a Texas Author. How are you fellas doing today?
Doing well, thank you.
All right.
Glad to be here.
It's good to have y'all. So we have, I guess, first off, seeing as how we just went through that, who wants to pull up the two books on A Means to Freedom?
I got them right here. All 1,000 pages.
Now, these are two books that have the entire collection of letters that are in existence of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard to each other. And their correspondence started in 1930, but they were known about, or they knew about each other. Howard knew about Lovecraft's stories that appeared in Weird Tales. And then once Howard's stories started getting printed in Weird Tales, Lovecraft starts paying attention to Robert E. Howard.
Lovecraft said later that he had first noticed Robert E. Howard in about 1926. 1925 is when Howard broke in to Weird Tales. The first account of Robert E. Howard in Lovecraft's letters comes from 1929, because there's that 2-period gap between Howard's first publications in Weird Tales in 25, and then in 27 he starts to get in more regularly, and Lovecraft started picking up on that, and he started appearing in his letters in 1929. And then in June 1930, The Rats in the Walls was reprinted in Weird Tales. It had first been printed in 1924, but there was so much reader interest in the stories from the early Weird Tales that Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales, decided to start reprinting some of them. So he reprinted The Rats in the Walls, and in that story, there's a section where the protagonist character is sort of devolving back through past family associations and incarnations. So he starts out with modern English, and he goes back to Elizabethan English, and then Middle English, and then Old English, and then it's set in Wales, so it should go to Cymric. But Lovecraft didn't know any Cymric. So what he did is he had a story in Best Psychic Detective Tales by Fiona MacLeod, Scottish author, called
William
The
Sharp. Actually,
Yeah.
William
Fiona
Sharp. Yep.
Yeah, William Sharp writing as Fiona MacLeod.
Piano without.
So in there, he's a Scottish author. He's part of the Celtic Twilight, the Celtic revival that's trying to revive the Scottish national identity. So he throws a bunch of Scottish Gaelic passages into the story, and Lovecraft lifts one. It's a curse that this woman is casting at this guy that she doesn't like. And Lovecraft just plops that in the story, figuring no one will ever notice.
And he writes, this is where he writes to a friend, and this is what I like. This is what he wrote. The only objection to the phrase is that it's Gaelic instead of Cymric, as the south of England location demands. With anthropology, details don't count. Nobody will ever stop to note the difference.
Yeah, that was from Frank Belknap blog. Yeah. But this was when Robert E. Howard was really reaching the crescendo of his own Celtic phase. It's when he had the most Celtic identity coming to the fore. He had some friends that were also big Celtophiles, Tevis Clyde Smith and Harold Priest. So he was really into it, and he was trying to learn some Gaelic with the aid of this English-Irish dictionary that he had. So when he reread that story, he was like, this is, this author I really like, and the story's set in Britain. And he noticed that it was Gaelic instead of Cymric. It was Scottish instead of Welsh. So he figured, maybe Lovecraft believes in this minor theory that these Gaelic speakers actually colonized Wales, and the Brythonic speakers came in later. So he wrote this long letter to Farnsworth Wright, which didn't survive, and Wright forwarded it on to Lovecraft. And Lovecraft, of course, wrote back admitting what he'd actually done. And that was the start of it. That was how they got into their whole correspondence that built out for the rest of Howard's life and most of Lovecraft's. Just 6 years of writing back and forth to each other.
If I can, Bobby, let me jump in. We do have, at the very least, a copy, if not a draft, of the letter that Howard wrote to Farnsworth Wright, and I'll read a little bit of it. Dear Mr. Wright, I have long looked forward to reading Mr. Lovecraft's The Rats in the Wall, and it certainly comes up to all expectations. I was amazed by the sweep of his imagination, not so much because of the extent of his reachings into the realms of imagination, which, though cosmic enough in this story, he has exceeded in other tales to my mind, but because of the strange and unthinkable bypath into which he has wandered in this tale. Jumping down, the climax of the story alone puts Mr. Lovecraft in a class by himself. Undoubtedly, he must have had the most unusual and wonderfully constructed brain of any man in the world. He alone can paint pictures and shadows and make them terrifically real. Now, let me jump on in. And here it goes. And I note from the fact that Mr. Lovecraft has his character speaking Gaelic instead of Cymric, in denoting the age of the Druids, that he holds to Lloyd's theory as to the settling of Britain by the Celts. This theory is not generally agreed to, but I scarcely think that it has ever been disproved, and it was upon this that my story, The Lost Race, was based, that the Gaelic tribes preceded the Cymric peoples into Britain by way of Ireland and were later driven out by them. And he continues on. Let's see. I may write a story one day upholding a certain theory of science, letters, anthropology, or whatnot, and the next day a story upholding a theory directly opposite. A fiction writer whose job is to amuse and entertain should give all theories equal scope and justice. But I'm taking up too much of your time. Cordially, Robert E. Howard.
Yeah.
So
And those first, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, especially those first couple of paragraphs where he's praising H.P. Lovecraft, probably made the letter to Lovecraft even more exciting and something he really enjoyed too. So
yeah, those first letters between Robert E. Howard and Lovecraft are fascinating because they're very atypical for Howard. Rusty Burke once noticed that Robert E. Howard is one of Lovecraft's greatest correspondents because we have these long, regularly paced letters. They were corresponding regularly. They got up to like 30, 35 pages for some of them, but they were full of interest. They were wide ranging. They were deep letters, good conversation. And you don't see that with most of Lovecraft's correspondence. But while Howard was one of Lovecraft's best correspondents, he's like 2 books out of 20 of Lovecraft's published correspondence, he is the chief correspondent for Robert E. Howard. If you look at all the letters we have left of Robert E. Howard, there's a fair number to Tevis Clyde Smith, there's a few to Harold Priest, there's some to Farnsworth Wright, but there is nothing that matches the sheer scope and volume of letters to Lovecraft. Those are the ones that really survived and got published later on. There's 3 volumes in the collected letters, and there's 2 volumes in A Means to Freedom.
Yeah.
That really says it all just in terms of how much they had. And those first letters between Lovecraft and Howard, sorry if I'm just, rambling on here, throw up a hand if you want me to shut up so you can say something. But those first letters between Lovecraft and Howard are fascinating because they're very atypical for Howard. He's being very differential. He tries to be very scholarly. He did drafts. You've got an 8-10 page letter, and he does a draft of it before he does a final copy, just so that it's nice and neat, and he's got everything worked out as far as his arguments, and he's put a little space in there so he can scribble in some Greek letters that he's copying out of a dictionary, just so he can try to keep up and impress H.P. Lovecraft. And Lovecraft, he's writing these scribbly little hieroglyphics almost. He had a very dense, small script, and he'd write with a free-flowing ink pen, not a typewriter. And they carried on like that, and he was very impressed with Robert E. Howard starting off. He just thought, wow, this guy really knows his stuff. And as they developed, they get friendlier with each other. They relax a little. The letters shift up, and Howard begins to disagree with him. And Lovecraft, he likes argument. He doesn't have a problem with an argument. So he loves it when they start getting into the back and forth. But you guys want to talk about any of that?
I would agree with you in terms of you can see, as you said, Howard's first few letters, or first several letters to Lovecraft, where he's very differential, dear Mr. Lovecraft. But as their friendship develops through their letters, they just start calling each other. It's dear HPL. Then he goes dear REH, and then he does the phonetic spelling of REHARI. Is it AICH or whatever that Lovecraft uses, along some of the other pet names he has for, like, Clark Ashton Smith, how he does the mock Egyptian Clark Ashton and all that other stuff. But you can definitely see that they get more and more friendly. It's just start talking to each other. And although sometimes when their letters, I guess the arguments they have do get a little bit too deep, you can kind of see that Howard does go back to dear Mr. Lovecraft on some of the letters when, he's like, I'm going to say something mean to you, or I'm going to apologize to you because I did say something mean to you. What do you think, Will?
Same thing you've all said. I mean, he starts off with Mr. Lovecraft, and Lovecraft responds with Mr. Howard, and they both, in many ways, start sounding like fanboys because they're praising each other's work and their writing and how important they are, within the discipline, et cetera, et cetera. So it's entertaining to read that exchange, and then how it evolves as the letters go on and becomes less formal, more informal, but still professional.
Yeah.
And then eventually, toward the later letters, you start getting more of, the snapping comments toward each other, the biting. So, I mean, they're like two buds hanging out now. It's we can trash each other and it's perfectly okay.
So
Yeah,
the first, continue.
sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. The first couple letters are sometimes a bit hard for people to get through because they're very dense and they go into anthropology almost immediately. This was a time when the racial narrative of history was very prominent. H.G. Wells had done it in his outline of the history of the world, and Howard was a big fan of that. It was one of his main ways of approaching fiction as history, or history as fiction, was the racial narrative. So you get like the racial drifts of the Aryans and all that. And that jibes completely well with the early nationalist narratives of like the Book of Invasions for Ireland. Just the idea that you had these conquering waves washing across the British Isles, leaving behind these people that were a mixed people or different nationalities and ethnicities that came together in different ways. And Howard had his own unique spin on that in fiction. And that was his stories about the Picts. And there's a very distinct difference between the Picts as he was talking about them before Lovecraft and after he starts getting talking with Lovecraft. And if you read The Lost Race and you read about the Picts as these stunted giants, or if you read the Del Rey collection about Bran Mak Morn, The Last King, and you'll read Patrice Lunet, I think, was talking about how Howard developed the Pictish idea. But then he comes into contact with Lovecraft, and Lovecraft said, well, you've got some good ideas there, but this is what Arthur Machen was doing. And Lovecraft and Howard had both read Arthur Machen's Little People stories, but they'd come away with it with different ideas. Howard had thought that Machen's Little People, this idea of a stunted Aborigine race in Britain, was identical with his Picts. But Lovecraft said, no, 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 they're different. The Picts and these monstrous little people are different. And Howard picked that up and ran with it. And that's where you get the Children of the Night and the People of the Dark, and eventually the Worms of the Earth, which is one of Howard's great stories. But the People of the Dark is one of the really interesting ones because this hero of that is an Irish reaver named Conan, who swears by Crom.
Yep.
And this is before he does any of the Hyborian Age stories, but this is one of his Irish prototypes for what would become Conan the Cimmerian. And part of that is because he was corresponding with Lovecraft, and he was taking these ideas that Lovecraft gave him and working them out into his own system in his own way. And that's really fascinating to watch that process fold out. If you're reading the stories as they're coming together and you're reading in the letters where they're having these arguments and then it goes into the stories, that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. Almost from the beginning, like you said, the first few letters they start talking about anthropology. And then they start getting into a little bit of the history of the British Isles a little bit. And from there, they go on to just history in general, classical history, as Lovecraft was a huge fan of classical history. Howard, not so much. Poetry. Howard loved Lovecraft's poetry, and Lovecraft loved Howard's poetry. And especially in the letters where Howard would send copies of his poems to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft would do the same, send copies of his poems to Howard, so they could each read and talk about the poetry of each other. Then from there, they started talking about the regions where each one lived, describing it to each other, giving the history of the region. Lovecraft's history of Rhode Island and the Atlantic states, and the places he would travel to Canada, down to Florida to see Robert Barlow. And then Howard starting to tell Lovecraft about the history of Texas and some of the places that Howard had traveled to, such as Arkansas, and then the history of his family as it moved from the Atlantic coast down through Mississippi on across into Arkansas and Texas. And
To me, biographically, this is extremely important, especially in terms of when they talk about, Lovecraft talks about Providence and Howard starts talking about Cross Plains, because now they're talking not just about people, but about place, and place matters. This is why at the beginning of the biography, this is how I opened up. The prologue essentially is a tour of Cross Plains, getting to understand the environment and the place in which Howard, essentially wrote and spent a good portion of his adult life. And so, to me, this is key. Now, Howard mentions this in some different letters, and he mentions it at different times. In one, he wrote that man is greatly molded by his surroundings. And I believe, for instance, that the gloominess in my own nature can be partly traced to the surrounding of a locality in which I spent part of my babyhood, which, of course, he's talking about Dark Valley near Peaster, Texas. Lovecraft responds, and Lovecraft talks about really Each average American is a citizen of his own section, alone in the fullest sense of the whole fabric. He knows the political externals and high spots as textbooks and causal reading there have sketched them. But his knowledge of intimate details, folkways, sources, backgrounds, and deep culture trends is generally confined to the vaguely bonded subdivisional unit in which he grows up, or at least to that unit and the spatially and chronologically contiguous units which have shared its fortunes to the historic screen. To me, I mean, again, you look at how Lovecraft, where he lived in Providence, a larger city, more metropolitan, more urban, more on the East Coast, built up over a long, long history. Howard is not too far removed from the frontier. Cross Plains is a really small town if you've ever been there. It wasn't much bigger at the time that Howard was there. I mean, about 1,800 population. Just the vast differences between those. But to me, it gets even more important because if you think about it, they're talking about their differences of the environments they grow up in. But think about the differences between their time where they grew up or where they lived in our time. And it is vastly different because, I mean, we have smartphones and internet and, all of this AI stuff now. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Rob.
Hey, Rob.
Howdy.
So who talks about, their environment when you exchange information with another person? I mean, what am I going to say? Oh, I have 6 Starbucks in my town. I have 2 McDonald's. We have an Olive Garden. Every place you go is the same. And social media, of course, connects us and makes everything the same. So the sameness is there. Whereas for Howard and Lovecraft, it's vastly different. And to me, I think that's extremely important that place matters.
Yeah. Rob, I just want to tell you, we were going in on the travel sections of the letters and how Lovecraft and Howard were talking about their own backgrounds and families. And I always found the travel letters some of the most fascinating and just pure descriptive sections in their correspondence, because this was the great travel time of both their lives. This was when Lovecraft was taking his bus trips down to Florida. He was going through the southern states. He got to Key West. He got to New Orleans. He got to St. Augustine. He went up to Quebec. He went to Washington, D.C., and he went to these places and he wrote about them to Howard. And Howard, for his part, he went to New Mexico. He went down to the Mexican border and he was writing about that to Lovecraft. And they appreciated what they read because it was someplace they could never get to themselves.
Now, let me
I
jump in.
agree with what you just said. It's one of the things I wanted to bring up, but you beat me to it. So, that's what happens when you have a meeting after school.
Well, I got one for you. Okay. So we were talking
let me just stop you.
About the travels and background. Sorry.
Let me just, so we can introduce our new person to everybody else. We've just been joined by Rob Roehm, who was the former editor of all of, or most of the Foundation's Howard books that were put out in the first editions. He's also the expert on the genealogy of the Howard family. He's also traveled to every place that Bob Howard traveled to or said that he traveled to. And he's also traveled to most of the counties that the Howards traveled to, hunting down information of Dr. Howard, where he would show up to register as a doctor to practice in the county. And he's written several other books on Howard stuff, such as all of Howard's existing school papers, drawings, the collected letters of Dr. Isaac Howard. Anything else I missed, Rob?
I don't know. That's embarrassing.
And he also
he wrote the foreword to my book. Is that good?
That's good.
Add that one on there. All right. Yeah.
And he also has a website like Bobby, Howard History as .com or .com or
.com, and Bobby's is much more active than mine.
Okay. But again, his website will be listed in the description for you to go and look at and read all of the stuff that he's put up there. So getting back to their travel logs and their letters, I know that they would also send each other pictures that they would take on their travels. They were quite big into sharing photographs of their travels and of people that they knew with each other. I can remember the letters of Howard where he was asking for and received photographs of the people in the Lovecraft circle, Frank Belknap Long, Donald Wandry, several other people, and then sending photos of the places that he'd been to, such as Arkansas, the Washita River, Fort McCabe, most famously here in Texas, and then other roadside images in Arkansas and Texas. And I know that Lovecraft would also send the not photographs, the postcards from the various places that he would travel to, where he would also write on the back. And if you folks ever get to the Howard house, one of the postcards from Lovecraft to Howard is on display so that you can see how Lovecraft would write and use every quarter inch of a postcard to write something on. And it's just amazing that you could even write what he would write on the, or read what he would write on the postcard.
I've got a question for Rob. Since we're talking about how Howard and Lovecraft would share about their history and their family, how accurate is the genealogy that Howard talks to Lovecraft about?
I don't remember, exactly what Howard told Lovecraft, but in general, he's not great as a genealogist. I'm not sure if it's because he didn't have good sources, but my feeling is that he relied too heavily on what his parents told him. And a lot of the dates are wrong, a lot of the people are wrong. There you go. But most of the thing I always tell people is that the what he thought was correct, it was just off by years, depending on who you're talking about. The old story about Hester's birth date being greater or less than she actually claimed it was to him might have caused problems in his tracking down the urban side in particular. And Dr. Howard is notoriously bad at remembering dates. He gets his own birth date wrong later in life and early in life too. So you've got to take everything that Howard says with a grain of salt, but you can use that to find the actual information. He thought his family landed in Georgia way earlier than they actually did. I imagine that's because his dad probably learned that from his dad, and no one knew that Henry Howard was actually born in Virginia and moved to Georgia later on, where Robert E. Howard's grandpa was finally born. So it's little things like that. I think that a lot of it is just family legend that's got handed down, and Howard reported it faithfully. It just happened to be incorrect.
Yeah, and there might also be a little bit of Texas tall tale in some of those
Oh, for
stories.
sure, for sure. Although, one of the biggest tales in it is, his McHenry ancestor was born on the Atlantic, crossing the ocean. I've found a couple of Daughters of the American Revolution membership forums where people have said just that about that guy. So
Yeah.
he wasn't the only one that thought that. It was a family legend. It may or may not be true, but he got it from somewhere, I think. But you're probably right in that he exaggerated some other things for effect, like the where his grandpa Irvin was chased by Geronimo. He did have a mine in New Mexico around the time that Geronimo was operating over there. Is it Geronimo? Uh, but whether or not that actually happened, that's a question that remains unanswered.
Yeah. But this is something I want to emphasize that we haven't talked about yet, how we read the letters. Because just because it's in the letters doesn't mean it's accurate and doesn't mean it's the whole story. Like in all their 6 years of correspondence, H.P. Lovecraft never mentions his wife, not once, never mentions his marriage at all. He very seldom mentions his mother or his father, who were both dead at that point. And novel and Price is only ever mentioned by Howard by inference. It's like, oh, I had a love affair and broke it off again, and that sort of thing. But so there's all this information outside of the letters that sort of informs how we actually read them. And you can't take everything exactly as they were presented, because these were two guys from two different sections, and they were presenting versions of themselves to each other. And when we talk about that, it's like at the very beginning when Howard's being very formal, that's him presenting a persona to H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft, in turn, is presenting a persona to Robert E. Howard, this Texan who's writing these adventurous stories. So there's things that Lovecraft does in other letters he never does with Howard. Okay? Like all the cutesy names that he comes up for with Howard, like Two Gun Bob, Sagebush Braj, the Terror of the Plains, he never says that to Howard directly. He would feel like he was insulting the guy, and he didn't want to insult him. But he's also being very much the stiff Yankee whenever it comes to civilization or policing or anything where they're having an argument. And there's a couple times in other letters to other people where Lovecraft will let down his hair and pretend that he's this Aryan barbarian type. Never does that with Howard. Not once.
Them exaggerating things reminds me of the story that Howard tells, and not just to Lovecraft, I think he tells it to other people, about having a car crash in Rising Star, where he and Lindsay Tyson and some other friends from Cross Plains are on their way to Brownwood to see either a football game or a boxing match. The stories differ. But they hit a pole on their way home in the middle of the street, and Howard talks about how his chest is rams into the steering wheel, and there's blood and gore. And then years later, Lindsay Tyson told DeCamp when DeCamp came calling about interviews that, oh yeah, we hit this pole. No one got hurt. It was just a little fender bender. But Howard told the story pretty well.
Yeah, I think he said in the letter that besides his father having to sew him up, I think he also had to sew up, I think it was a Dave Lee that
Yeah, I forget who was
had
in the
gone
car,
through the
but yeah,
windshield and was
it's a
all torn
whopper.
up.
There's no, I think it was Tim Arney tried to find reference to a big crash in the Rising Star newspaper. He couldn't find it. I've never found it, and the answer is probably because there was no big crash. There's just a little bump.
Well, while you're here, because I know in talking with you earlier, Rob, you wanted to go into how the Lovecraft Howard letters were collected.
Oh, that's a whole story. And I found the name of the gentleman that I forgot last time we talked. Um, and I'm actually going through Doc Howard's letters again for maybe a revised version of the collected letters. So I just read some of that too. Dr. Howard told E. Hoffman Price that he was going to send the letters to him. That would be, well, let's back all the way up. When Lovecraft died, Robert Barlow got a hold of Dr. Howard to get Lovecraft's side of the correspondence between Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard. Dr. Howard agreed to send him the copies of the letters so that they could transcribe them in return for him sending Robert's letters back to him. And he kept them. I'm pretty sure that Lovecraft's letters got sent back to Dr. Howard after some transcriptions were taken by Derleth and Wandry. However you say that guy's name.
Wandry, I think.
So Dr. Howard tells E. Hoffman Price in like 1943 that he has those letters and he's going to send them to him. And then then the year turns, and in 44 he's like, oh, I can't find those letters. They must have got burned up with all this other stuff that got burned when he moved from Cross Plains to Ranger. The actual Lovecraft letters were probably burned at that time, along with a bunch of poetry that Howard had written. But the letters do end up getting sent to E. Hoffman Price, whether Dr. Howard did it himself or whether it was part of the deal after he died. And then his Dr. Kirkendall, who was the executor of the will, whether he did that, he did end up sending Price 4 boxes of stuff. E. Hoffman Price ended up with the actual Robert E. Howard letters to Lovecraft. And from there, he started handing things out. He received the letters. He also received 4 boxes of other materials, drafts, unpublished things, all kinds of stuff. And, like any fan would do, I guess, he started handing them out to his friends and whatnot. And the letters end up with, they appear to have gone to Francis Laney for a minute. And then a gentleman named Stuart Boland ends up with
Yeah.
them. And he told Glenn basically, Glenn was looking for this stuff for a long time.
Let me say Glenn. You mean Glenn?
Glenn Lord. Yeah, he started looking for things in like the 50s when he got back from Korea. He's been looking for stuff for a long time. Stuart Boland tells Glenn that the letters are with some a weird named woman. I shouldn't say weird named woman. A woman whose name is strange to me. And she had got them from someone and was supposedly typing them up and then didn't get paid for it. So she was holding on to them. And if perhaps a little money could be thrown at her, we could get those letters back.
Yeah.
Well, Glenn threw some money and the letters appeared magically. And that's how we ended up getting those letters. It took a circuitous route to finally get the Howard side back. The Lovecraft side apparently was burned when Dr. Howard moved to Ranger, but thankfully a lot of them were transcribed when Arkham House fired up the transcription machine after Dr. Howard sent them the copies. And I think that's all we have. But a bunch of postcards.
Yeah.
The Lovecraft postcards survived because Dr. Howard gave them to his nephew Wallace before he died. And Wallace then, when L. Sprague de Camp came to interview him for the biography, Wallace was like, "Hey, I have these postcards." And de Camp was like, "Hey, you can make some money on these." And they got sold, but then eventually people made copies and we have some copies of them now.
Yeah. Let me add just a couple things there. So Francis T. Laney was the editor of The Acolyte, which was a very famous fanzine in the 1940s, which published material on Lovecraft, Robert Howard, and the Weird Tales group. Stuart M. Boland was a librarian in San Francisco who traveled extensively, and he corresponded with Lovecraft, with C.L. Moore, and he claims to have written to Robert Howard, but none of those letters survive.
Yeah, he wrote an article about it in The Acolyte.
Yeah, he's really a bit of an interesting character. We don't know enough about him to know whether he was bullshitting or not. But yeah, he shows up in odd places in the 40s.
And also, Robert Barlow, for the folks who haven't watched the video with Patrice, Robert Barlow was a super fan living in Florida that became good friends with H.P. Lovecraft. And he would write letters to the various Weird Tales authors asking for their autographs and then for them to send copies of their drafts of the stories that got published in Weird Tales. And so he ended up with some of the drafts of Robert E. Howard's stories of Conan and others that were recovered upon his death.
Yeah, after he died, they went to his mother, who sold them to August Gerleth, who sold them to different people. That's how we got some of those letters. All right, so back on the Lovecraft and Howard correspondence. Did you have anything else you wanted to go into next, or are we just wheeling it?
Well, just continuing talking, I was gonna, go into some of the stuff that some of their favorite things that they talked about in the letters, especially ending up such as cats and Howard's Beast from the Abyss, and then also the rattlesnake rattles that he would send to Lovecraft. So we could talk about that for a little bit too.
Okay, well, let's start with when Lovecraft was down in Florida visiting Henry S. Whitehead, who was a contributor to Weird Tales. He wrote these stories of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And he was also a correspondent with Robert Howard for a short period of time. So they knew each other a little bit. And when Lovecraft went down, Whitehead captured a spider for him in a jar of alcohol. and he sent it back with Lovecraft for his cabinet of curiosities. That Lovecraft sort of had these weird stuff that people would send him or give him. So Robert E. Howard, being in Texas, sent him a set of rattlesnake rattles. And of course, being Robert E. Howard, he didn't just send him that. He wrote with a set of rattlesnake rattles, which went along with it, which Lovecraft was very tickled by. It was a great little moment of their friendship. You know, you can imagine opening this package from Texas and, there's a set of rattlesnake rattles in there. This is great. Lovecraft never really got a chance to reciprocate with those kind of gifts because he didn't have the money. You know, he wasn't the kind of guy who was going to go out and kill a bobcat and send him a talon or something. So it was really just postcards as far as Lovecraft was concerned. But it's a fun
photographs.
One. Yeah.
That's one of the things that I think is really interesting about the two. You know, if Lovecraft was to walk outside of his front door, he's in this New England neighborhood, and it's like Leave It to Beaver. You know, it's this neighborhood. If Robert E. Howard walks out his door, there's a dirt road. There's a couple of houses across the street, and a bunch of oil derricks poking up in over here in town. But over here, there's wilderness, and there's hills, and it's probably yellow, not green like in Providence. It's striking to me how different the view is from wherever they're writing. But that these guys, they really tried to get along for a long time, despite their really different backgrounds.
And a lot of the stuff that they wrote about in their letters, we talk about how Lovecraft influenced Howard. Because if you read some of Howard's stories, bits and pieces of the letters creep into what Howard was writing. If you read Queen of the Black Coast, where it opens up with the mad judge being really pissy against Conan for not informing on his friend, that's coming almost straight out of the letters, because Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were talking about how the justice system worked in their different parts of the country. And Howard was very much about, your individual honor and rights, and he didn't trust the cops, and he thought everybody was crooked, and he didn't like prohibition. And, Lovecraft was putting on the air that, okay, yeah, this is really, you should obey the police, and the Justice Department is mostly good, and there's no corruption, or it gets taken care of. And, it works its way into Howard's letters, and from the letters into the stories that way. We don't talk as much about the influence on Lovecraft because Lovecraft didn't write as much. Howard was very much a professional writer. It's how he earned his money. He was writing all the time. He was go, 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 go. Lovecraft was an auteur. He didn't have money, but he had his principles. So he wasn't writing nearly as much. But he was still influenced by Howard in some of what he wrote. The Whisper of Darkness includes a reference to the Bran cult, because Robert E. Howard had just written stories about Bran MacMorn, and especially Bran MacMorn having a cult after he died.
The Dark Man.
That appeared in The Dark Man and The Children of the Night. So Lovecraft said, that's great. I'm putting that into the Cthulhu mythos. And, when Howard decided to make The Black Book by von Junst, and that was going to be his mythos tome, Lovecraft helped navigate the discussion for what the actual German title would be. And they landed on Unasfraklichen Kulten after a massive three-way argument between E. Hoffman Price, Farnsworth Wright, and August Derleth that was finally settled by C.C. Semp, who was this artist at Weird Tales that had come over from Germany. And he did really some bad art for Weird Tales, but he decided, well, Unasfraklichen Kulten sounds better. So that's what they ended up going with. And there's one story that Lovecraft did in 1935 for a revision client called Out of the Aeons, which most of it is your typical Lovecraftian story about a petrified mummy and ancient cults and everything. But in the middle, there's this segment that could have come straight out of the Hyborian Age. It's just this little snippet of sword and sorcery prehistory that Lovecraft snuck in there because he was writing to Howard all the time, and they were talking about this, and Clark Ashton Smith was doing it on his own thing. So he wanted that little piece of prehistory for himself. And then you get into The Shadow Out of Time, which was 36, and they're talking about Kram-Ya, the Sumerian chieftain, and the Serpent Men of Elusia are among all these personages that are from various points in Earth history that come across in the Great Race of the Yith. A lot of people that haven't read Lovecraft have no idea what I'm talking about, but the thing to get away with is Robert E. Howard had an influence on Lovecraft just as Lovecraft had an influence on Robert E. Howard. These guys were sharing ideas, they were an influence on each other. It was a two-way street. It wasn't just one of them pontificating to everybody else and absorbing. They were give and take very much.
Going off that, especially starting, I guess, about 1934 or so, the letters between them where they would start talking shop about writing, about the writers they knew, talking about what pulp magazines to try to write for, what they'd heard about the pulp magazines, as their treatment of writers, what they were paying. And that stuff is also fascinating, from being able to see how a writer's life was back in the 1930s in the pulp fields. And
no comment.
Going back to one of the things that, again, in regards to, or in the same vein of the rattlesnake rattle, is that although Howard was a dog man, he also loved cats. And they had several cats running around the house there at Cross Plains that he took care of. And Lovecraft also loved cats, so they started talking in their letters about their love of cats and treatment of cats. And he would get several of the letters. Howard would talk about what was going on with some of his cats, and talking about how one of the cats was having skin problems, and now he would grease the cat up with butter to try and save the cat's skin. But that caused him to write a nice essay that he sent to Lovecraft called The Beast from the Abyss, talking about cats and how they were such special animals in regards to dealing with humans and humans dealing with the cats. What did y'all think about that
This
essay?
is another part of the two that I find interesting sometimes. I haven't read these letters in a long time, but Lovecraft's cat it's a cat that lives in a neighborhood. The Howards had cats because they had a barn in the back, and they kept cats to keep the mice out. That's what people in the country do. You've got a barn with things in it, and you don't want rodents getting in there, so you keep the cats. And I just think that's interesting because these guys are coming at it from different angles again, and I think they probably knocked their heads a little bit about it also. But Howard's uh, Howard's essay about cats is just, it's got to be tongue in cheek to me. There's so much in it. No one could feel this way about cats, but by all accounts, he loved animals, so maybe he did.
Well, Howard's essay, The Beast from the Abyss, was a response to an essay Lovecraft had written called Cats and Dogs, because Lovecraft was a big cats guy ever since he was a kid. When he was about 3 or 5 years old, the family adopted a black kitten. And because this was the 1890s, and it was sort of the thing you did, they gave it a racially pejorative name. And Lovecraft loved this little black kitten. He raised it until it was a cat. Then in 1904, his grandfather died. They had to sell the family house, and the cat disappeared. They never saw it again. And that was Lovecraft's last pet, because they were too poor to keep another cat in the house. They couldn't do the taking care of costs for another cat. So Lovecraft was heartbroken And he always remembered that cat. And when he did write The Rats in the Walls, he put that cat's name in there for the black cat that's in the story. So that also ties into how we first talked to Robert E. Howard in 1930 when they reprinted The Rats in the Walls. He read about that cat. And of course, Robert E. Howard, being where he was in rural Texas, he wouldn't see any problem with the name. I mean, it was very common at the time to give a black pet a name like that. But Howard couldn't afford a pet, but he would pet every street cat that he ever came across. And these were just, your typical mangy little living in the gutter, off scraps in the garbage cats, but he loved them. He named them. He made up this fraternity, Kappa Alpha Tau, and he, officially blessed every other cat from every friend that he ever had as a member of this thing. So they did bond about that a little bit. But it was very much a case of that Howard picked up on that, I think, because they don't talk about dogs that much. And Howard was very much a dog lover. But at the time he corresponded with Lovecraft, his pet Peaches was dead.
Patches.
And he never, Patches. And Patches never shows up in the letters. It's just the wound was too deep, I think.
Yeah. Patches died in like 27 or something like that. 1927.
Yeah.
Maybe earlier. Right.
All right. Since we're talking about that, why don't we hit the elephant in the room? Racism in the letters.
All right.
Okay, so this is how it goes. H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were both white men during what they call the nadir of race relations in the United States. They saw the rise of the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. They saw the rise of Nazi Germany. They saw Congress pass the first acts that established a quota system on the basis of race to restrict immigration to the United States. Before that, it was just, if you got here somehow, walk, crawl, or swim, you were here. You were an American. After that, you had to go through a whole process to become a citizen. And so it was a very racially charged era, and they were products of it. They believed in white supremacy. They believed in many stereotypes of race, but they were in very different sections. And that influenced how they individually viewed race on certain aspects. So they were both anti-Semitic, but Robert E. Howard's anti-Semitism was more theoretical because he didn't know that many Jews. There were not that many Jewish families in that portion of Texas. And there weren't many people that would set him straight about how Jews were because there weren't that many Jews in that section of Texas. While Lovecraft went to New York and he had a Jewish best friend and a Jewish wife. And these were people that would very much call Lovecraft out if he said anything anti-Semitic. So you can see the difference in their letters to other people about how they talk about Jews and black people and Mexicans or other Hispanic peoples and immigrants. But when they talk to each other, they're talking as one white guy in this section to one white guy in the other section. And they start to sort of compare notes. And it's very cautious at first. No one just comes out and says something racist immediately. They're feeling each other out a little bit. You have to sort of read into the letters about this. Okay, what are they saying? What are they not saying? Because they started off on all the anthropology stuff and all these races of history, and slowly they get a feel for each other, and they say, okay, we're on more or less the same wavelength as far as race goes. They both believe in white supremacy. They both have basically the same ideas about Jews. Lovecraft has got a few differences, but nothing he's going to correct Howard on, and vice versa. And where they really start to get into interesting conversations is comparing the different Hispanic peoples they know, because Robert E. Howard knows Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and Lovecraft saw Puerto Ricans in New York, and Spanish Americans in St. Augustine, and Cubans in Ybor City and Key West. And they've both been to New Orleans at different points in time. So, they've got stuff to talk about and talk about the old Spanish trail and everything. but they're not going into these big racist diatribes because they don't have to. You know, they're not trying to prove anything to either one of each other, except once or twice. There was a couple incidents where Howard was traveling, and he talks about some black motorists that he, gets angry and shakes his fists at because they're not driving right and they should have respect and yada yada yada. And Lovecraft goes, I think you did that just right. I think you handled that situation well. And you can see this is where they're getting a little performative toward each other. They are not just presenting their own views, but they're trying to present the person they think the other person wants to see, because this is not how they would talk with anybody else in any other letter. Because why would they? Everybody else that Robert E. Howard is talking with, he's either a fan, and he would never say this stuff to a fan, or he's a close friend, and they don't have to say it by letter because they just see each other. Yeah. And with Lovecraft, he very rarely has anybody that is on his wavelength that he will say openly racist stuff to. It's basically just his aunts and Robert E. Howard and a couple of white guys in Idaho. And even then, he's saying, like, I might say this to you, but don't share this with anybody else. But it's just very different atmospheres of what is acceptable. And that's what we read in their letters. Rob, check me on that.
No, I always say that racism was in the water. There was, I've done a lot of extensive searches through the Cross Plains Review of the time and the Brownwood Bulletin. And the things that are printed in those papers are offensive by today's standards because it's just so racist. There's, reports of the KKK having a meeting in Crosscut, and come on down and have fun at the barbecue with the KKK. Is it William Jennings Bryan? Some big politician at the time had a whole front page spread in the Brownwood Bulletin, and it's just a racist screed. But there it is, right? It's in your daily paper. And Callahan County, if you weren't the right color, you couldn't stay in the county overnight.
Yeah.
So, this is where Robert E. Howard is living. I doubt that Rhode Island was much better, but I assume it was a bit better, just because it was more cosmopolitan, had a larger population, had a college. There's more happening there. But yeah, these guys are talking to each other the way, anybody wink wink in the club would talk to each other back in the 20s and 30s.
But at the same time, you have to remember neither of these guys was in the KKK. Neither of them was a Nazi. When they did start to disagree on issues about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Robert E. Howard took the side of the Ethiopians, but it wasn't because he was, a big fan of Black Africans. It was because he hoped the Italians would get their teeth kicked in because he liked the underdogs and he didn't like fascists. And Lovecraft was, at that time, the mid-30s, 1933 to about 1934, he liked the idea of fascism. He liked the idea of centralized government, of a strong man, of a resurgence of national identity, until he saw what it was like in action. Once the Nazis started putting forth their plans in action, Lovecraft rapidly fell out of love with the idea of them. Like, he never really liked Hitler, but once Hitler started passing all the anti-Semitic laws that Lovecraft felt were very anti-scientific and burning books and stuff, Lovecraft was no longer a big fan. But that's one of the big arguments they had in their later letters was, fascism versus democracy and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia and how do you handle modern warfare. And yeah, it's neither of them taking a side for racial reasons, but it's underlying a lot of that just because that underlied a lot of the politics back then. All right. Sorry, John, I was cutting you off again. I keep doing that.
That's okay. Now, I was going to say that was one of the things when I was working on the ultimate edition of the collected letters, that as I would read Howard's letters to Lovecraft, it was my opinion that he was adopting a more racist attitude in the letters that he was writing to Lovecraft than what he normally would have shown or had towards others. And I would also add that according to Novel and Price, Howard did not agree with the Callahan County no blacks in Callahan County at sundown. And I believe, if I remember correctly, she said that when they were having one of their arguments about her dating a black man, that he was not so much against that in terms of racism, but it was more like in terms of how other people would react to her and how that would ruin her life with other people. And certainly, if she were to marry a black man, that if they had any kids, that the life of the kids would be bad too, because of all the other people treating them as being mixed race.
Yeah, Novel Price Ellis and Sonia H. Davis, who was Howard's ex-girlfriend and Lovecraft's ex-wife, they both wrote their memoirs long after the guys involved were dead. So they didn't exactly get a chance to respond, but they also wrote them long after World War II. And what was acceptable before World War II and after World War II was worlds apart for most of the United States. And so it's really hard to tell, is that completely accurate, or was that something that was emphasized by Novelin because of the attitudes of the era and she wanted to, get that in the book?
Well,
We
she
can't tell.
supposedly used her contemporary journals,
Yeah.
as the meat of the memoir. But
Yeah, I don't think she
I'm not
made
gonna.
anything up.
Yeah, we don't
I
know
don't
what
think she made
editing she
anything
did.
up, but she sometimes emphasized certain incidents over others. And that might be one where she was emphasizing a particular incident or a particular point of view to represent Bob as, to bring the subject out, let's say. Howard himself did not say anything like that while he was alive in his letters, but then why would he? Who would he talk about with that subject? Not Lovecraft, you know. Um,
All right. We got a question from one of our channel viewers asking about, did they talk in their letters about the New Orleans visits? And so let's go into that. We know that Lovecraft was going to take a trip down to New Orleans to take a look at the city, and that Bob was planning on trying to make it over to New Orleans to meet him and take him back into Texas. And so they were talking about that. And in the letters, Howard would relate some of the things that he remembered from the few months that they were living in New Orleans while his father was taking a continuing medical education course there, and some of the things he saw, and I guess some of the things he learned in his reading of history for Lovecraft to take a look at or be sure to see. And then in his letters to Bob, Lovecraft would write about what he saw and enjoyed about traveling down to New Orleans. And then also, while he was there, Howard sent it was a telegram to E. Hoffman Price, who lived in New Orleans, telling Price, Lovecraft's in New Orleans, get in touch with him, go meet him. And so he hooked up E. Hoffman Price and H.P. Lovecraft in New Orleans and started that friendship between those two. What do y'all think about that?
That's you did a great summary. After, I think that's the reason that Howard bought his first car, because he was trying to get to New Orleans to meet Lovecraft, but circumstances wouldn't allow. And you're right, he arranged for Price to meet him there instead. But then shortly thereafter, Bob took a ride to Fort Worth with Lindsay Tyson and his dad and picked up a car. And Lindsay Tyson taught him how to drive on the way back, just in case he needed to go to New Orleans to meet Lovecraft again.
Yeah.
I seem to remember something like one of the banks failing there in Cross Plains, that had taken out most of Howard's savings that he could have used to buy a car or fix up a car. And that was the main reason he couldn't make it to New Orleans to see Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, there's something like that. So E. Hoffman Price was another weird tailor, and he had not been corresponding with Lovecraft at this point. He was a correspondent with Robert E. Howard. They were friends, and Price was an engineer at a acetylene plant in Illinois, where he got to know the guys at Weird Tales. And then he got another job down in New Orleans. So he moved down to New Orleans with the wife and the kids. And that sort of went to hell. So he was living alone in the French Quarter with all the sex workers and, the typical New Orleans crowd. And Lovecraft came rumbling into town in 1932. And Howard was like, "You got to get with him." So he sends a telegram to Price. Price finds Lovecraft. They get together. And that's how we get Through the Gates of the Silver Key, which was the great collaboration between Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price, came from that 27-hour party that they had at Price's house in New Orleans in the Old City. And they started corresponding from there. And that's another great correspondence for Lovecraft, is his letters with E. Hoffman Price, because Price would go visit Howard twice in Texas, and he'd go visit Lovecraft in Providence, Rhode Island. And Price was the only one that could really travel because he was at loose ends. He was trying to be a professional pulp writer, and then he was trying to be a mechanic, and then he was trying to be a professional pulp writer again. And he was just driving all over the country whenever he felt like. And he could visit these people, and he did. So he was their go-between.
Sort of like
So
a
yeah, that
certain
was a great
California
moment.
teacher we know. Yeah, no, I was just going to add, in addition to that, I'm sorry if I cut you off, Bobby, but that I can remember one of the things that I remember off the top of my head is in one of the letters on what Howard was either talking to Lovecraft about what he needed to see, or after Lovecraft had returned, about he needed to go see the dueling oak there outside New Orleans. And then he went into the dueling, and one of the famous duels, I think it was with Ben Thompson and somebody else there, famous gunfighter in Texas. Then he talked about what he remembered of the French Quarter and the women at the early mornings in the French Quarter. And Lovecraft said, "Yeah, this is what the French Quarter was like when I went there several years after you were there," and continued talking about the various buildings that Lovecraft went to see, and stuff like that. It's just very fascinating, very interesting set of letters on the New Orleans trip. Y'all have anything else on New Orleans? Oh, you're muted, Rob. You're
Yeah, you can still go to New Orleans and see some of that stuff. The old Spanish fort is still there. It's I'm sure it's degraded since Howard's time, and it's more of like a small little neighborhood park. And the dueling oaks are now just one dueling oak because the other one was destroyed in a hurricane. But if you're walking around in the French Quarter, it still feels like the French Quarter, I'm sure. And you can visit the library where Howard discovered the Picts also. It's still there, but now it's a coffee shop slash yoga salon. Anyway, sorry to interject there.
Yeah,
not a problem.
yeah, and it has to be remembered, Howard's letters about the history of the Southwest, when he starts talking about the geography and the history and the personages, he talks about John Wesley Hardin and Quanah Parker. These are beautiful letters. They're long. He's filling pages of just historical data and narratives, and not all of it's true, and some of it's Texas tall tales, but it is an epic of the Southwest. And Lovecraft loved that stuff. He really was encouraging Howard to be a regional Texas writer, like August Derleth, who they also corresponded with. He wanted Howard to lean into that because he had such a gift for it. And Howard didn't always manage to do much with that during his lifetime. But there was at least one story that owes itself entirely to their correspondence, which is Black Canaan, because Howard had told Lovecraft the story about Kelly the Conjure Man, which he had heard when he was very young in Texas near the Arkansas border. And Lovecraft really encouraged him, you should take this story and run with it. You should write it up. You should write it up. And eventually Howard did. And that became Black Canaan, which is one of the most complex stories about race in the Southwest that either of them could ever have written. Howard uses the N-word more times in that story than Lovecraft does in every story he ever wrote. But there's a reason for it. And that reason is Howard was trying to present that racial conflict honestly. And it's not just white guy's good, black guy's bad. It's always much more complicated than that. And that comes out of their correspondence directly.
Would also say that, as Brian Lito pointed out, from the correspondence of Lovecraft and Howard, Pigeons from Hell was Howard's answer to Lovecraft on who had the better region for horror and spooky legends and spooky tales. So Howard said, okay.
Yeah, he made that argument. It has to be remembered that very early on in their correspondence, Howard had written some explicitly Lovecraft pastiche tales like The Blackstone and The Children of the Night. And these were stories that were referencing Lovecraft's Necronomicon and Lovecraft's mythos a little bit. But he was very much saying, okay, what can I do with Lovecraft's style and then take it in my own direction? But yeah, Pigeons from Hell is very much a Southern Gothic. It's not trying to ape Lovecraft's mythos at all, but it is very much taking that regional approach and applying it to horror, which is something that he tried to do in several stories. The Horror from the Mound, Old Garfield's Heart, which is one of my favorite Howard tales. The Secret of Lost Valley, although I think I might have screwed up the name on that one. It gets confused.
It's a different title. I'm not sure what it is, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, Howard tried to do these weird Southwest tales, and they're not all weird Westerns per se, but they're very much saying, okay, Lovecraft is doing all these tales in New England. What can I do for my region of the country that I know about, I know the flavor of? I can apply those same horror tropes down here in my own fashion and do it well. And he did, really.
The last story he was working on, I forget the name of it, Robert E. Howard, was in that vein.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Next Semmercat.
That.
Yeah.
Thank you, young people.
I think I'm older than both of you, and I still remember. All right, let's get into the big arguments and the letters that everybody who has any knowledge of the letters, civilization versus barbarism versus frontier living, brains versus brawn. We kind of talked on police and fascism. So I think
so the most important thing about it is it was not one argument. This was several.
One led into another. They just bled into each other.
There are several threads to the argument that they're running about parallel in different letters, and they come together and break apart again, and then they suddenly have another thing they need to say about it. And there's parts where Howard gets very snippy, where, you've declared me to be an enemy of mankind, yada, yada, yada. It starts off very basic. It sort of starts off with, I don't want to say it starts off with Whitehead, but Whitehead becomes one of the examples of what they're doing. They had started off talking about why they want to write and their different approaches to writing, and how Howard, he says, I would have been happy as an athlete. I would have been happy using the strength of my body and making my means of living that way. And Lovecraft saying, oh, but you have such a great mind. You were made to be a writer. You you should laud the mental over the physical. I'm putting words into Lovecraft's mouth because I'm trying to paraphrase the argument. And then Howard talks about this anecdote where Henry S. Whitehead at a party, he had this party trick. He'd take a deck of cards, he'd drive a nail through two corners, and then he'd rip it in half. And then he'd rip the halves in quarters. Great party trick. But, he was saying, okay, here's a guy that can write as well as either of us, but didn't stint the physical, because he must have had tremendous strength to do that. And it sort of sprawled out from there through all these different ideas and threads, and we call it civilization versus barbarism, or the physical versus the mental, but it's really all threads of the same long, ongoing argument through most of about 5 years of their writing.
Yeah. And also kind of going in civilization versus barbarism, that goes off on a side trail into what's the better position for humans to live in, civilization or living on the frontier where they're having to live by their wits and stay physically healthy. Another argument that they had that I can remember Howard getting very snippy with was writing for a living, for a commercial living, whereas Lovecraft was not so much into writing for commercial living, but writing for art's sake, whereas Howard was like, I love writing, but if I can make a living at it, that's what I'm going to do.
Right. I'm only doing that because it gives me the most freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Will Oliver's big argument for his new biography. Available now. Go buy it. No, but seriously, if you read stuff like Beyond the Black River, and you get to that last section where he goes, barbarism is the natural state of mankind, that's coming out of the Howard letters. That's coming out of their arguments over what is better. And it's also coming out of their different regional perspectives, because Howard was very much identifying himself with the Texas frontier folk. He was like one generation removed from the guys going over in Conestoga wagons, and he wishes he had been born in that earlier century, just so he could have experienced the freedom of the frontier as he imagined it. And he's trying to portray that to Lovecraft, and he's probably building himself up to it a little more than he actually felt, because he'll admit that, yeah, I would not have survived if you'd taken me back to ancient medieval times and had me swinging a sword or anything. I'm not built like that. I don't have that stamina and strength that I imagine these heroes had. But he does wish he had seen more of that frontier time before the ranges got closed in by barbed wire and the city sprang up and all the old things went away. And that goes into his stories. Lovecraft was very much taking on the persona of the ultra civilized Yankee in those conversations. That's how, he gets his back up a little. But at the same time, he deeply admired the perspective that Howard was taking. He didn't agree with him, but he admired it. And you know that because when Lovecraft was writing to everyone else in his circle, he'd say, look at what Robert E. Howard is writing. He'd send them letters that Howard wrote so they could read this stuff and go, isn't this great? This guy's fantastic. He's a character. But he's also, a very serious artist who's much better than he thought he could be. And you know that because when Howard dies in 1936 and Lovecraft is writing his memorial, and he starts off with like just a paragraph to one guy, and then he's writing very quickly news of the death, and he writes a paragraph to one guy, and then 2 paragraphs to the next, and 3 paragraphs to the next, and he's writing to about 20 different people. And when he gets to the end, you've got 2.5 pages of Lovecraft just lamenting what a great guy and great author that Robert E. Howard was. And he's pouring his heart out on it because this was his friend. This was the guy he knew for 6 years, being just the essence of the Texas writer, the epitome. There was no other Texas writer that could possibly live up to the standard that Robert E. Howard was. And he said that was the secret to all of Robert E. Howard's characters. He was in every one of them. And that really influenced how other people thought of Robert E. Howard, because they said, well, if Lovecraft said it, it must be right. Because Lovecraft knew Howard in a way no one else in the Weird Tales circle did. No one else had that kind of correspondence relationship with him, except maybe E. Hoffman Price. And Price didn't write like that. He'd wash up on Howard's store twice. He met the guy. He knew him in person for 5 days. He'd eat out for the rest of his life on it. But he did not have that deep appreciation for what Howard could do that Lovecraft had from their correspondence.
I'm gonna put a maybe on that, since we only recently discovered a letter from Howard to Price that has anything in it that's more than this is what I sold. The last couple letters that he wrote to Price in 1936 were only about, hey, my mom is sick, but I've broken into these new markets. They're written at a time when Howard is going through a lot of stress, and he's not writing long letters to anyone except for Lovecraft. Uh, but Will Oliver just found that a new letter from Howard to Price in somebody's collection in some university that is a couple of pages long, and it's got some meat in it. It's much more. There's more to their conversation going on than we previously knew about. So,
Yeah.
like I said, I'm just going to put a maybe on that, but we'll probably never know because for whatever reason, E. Hoffman Price didn't do a great job of saving his own letters from Howard.
Probably couldn't get any money for him, so
Right.
But I would say though, where you were bringing up Bobby about him wanting to live at the same time as the pioneers in Texas, he did get the experience of traveling in a wagon because that's how the Howards were traveling around Texas as Doc Howard was chasing the next big thing, is that they would do it in a covered wagon. So he had that experience as a young kid. And then just to further what you said about not being a big fan of Rome and Greece or Grecian civilizations and going for the underdogs, that there was that letter that I remember that he wrote to Lovecraft where he said, yeah, I may talk a big game, but if I was to live back in that time, I would be hieing myself to the nearest Roman town or civilization so I can live in the comforts that they had at that time, because there's no way I would be able to survive as a barbarian out on the frontiers, to paraphrase what he wrote in that letter. Do we have anything else we want to talk about on their big arguments in their letters?
Oh, nothing really comes to mind.
No.
Oh, one thing I want to say. Okay, so we tend to focus on Weird Tales because that was their common market. That was the one magazine that they both really applied to for both their fiction. But Howard wrote a lot more genres than Lovecraft did. He wrote sports and westerns and detectives and spicies. And while Lovecraft was not big on trying to chase those markets because he was the auteur, he appreciated that Howard did. And when Howard would ask him to read the stuff he'd written in those other markets, he would. So, we don't normally think of Lovecraft reading a boxing story because it just seems so counter to his character. But, Lovecraft knew about boxing too. He wasn't a huge fan of it in the way that Howard was, but he could appreciate that sense of action and the thrill that Howard put into the fiction. And he'd tell Howard about that. And he loved the comedy in the Breckinridge Elkins stories, the few that he read. And, we tend to get very focused on the weird fiction and how they disagreed, but they really had points of agreement that we don't tend to focus on just because they might seem out of character. It's more fun when they're disagreeing because, they get their blood up and the prose gets really exciting. But more often than not, Howard was just encouraging his friend to write, and Lovecraft was always thankful for whatever Howard was writing. They were very much trying to encourage each other to keep going, and they both needed that. in a very real sense. When they were at their lowest points and they were really struggling with just getting stuff out, having somebody say, I can't wait to see what you're going to write next, is so helpful. All right,
That's a
sorry, going on.
nice segue into our next question from one of our viewers. Who was Lovecraft's favorite characters or stories of Howard's, and who was Howard's favorite characters or stories of Lovecraft?
It's all you, Bobby.
Okay, Lovecraft loved the King Cole stories. When Howard died, he described them as sort of a weird peak. He didn't mind the Conan stories, but he did think that the Conan stories were a little too action-oriented and that some of the later ones fell off a bit, which, understandable. But he loved the two Cole tales that came out. He didn't really talk much about Bran McMorn. We know he read them, but he didn't talk much about it. Howard, Lovecraft didn't have many serious characters except one, Randolph Carter. And that was not a continuous series. That was not something you could easily follow because of how it was published. But Howard always said that his favorite Lovecraft tale was The Silver Key, which was a story of Randolph Carter finding the Key of Dreams after so many years and going back and reliving his childhood. And yeah, that very much fits in with sort of Howard's idea. It would have been really interesting if Howard had read The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, because that was as close as Howard ever got to an adventurous fantasy, as close as Lovecraft ever got to an adventurous fantasy. But it was never published, and Lovecraft never sent it to him. So we don't get to see that.
Lucky Howard.
Yeah, I know Rob hates that story, but
Yeah, I was going to say that because I was looking back through the letters to see what Howard wrote to Lovecraft or about Lovecraft, and it seems to me that the one story that we seem to get the most mentions from Howard on is At the Mountains of Madness. But for just about every time that Howard mentioned a letter or a story of Lovecraft's in his letters, it was always, I love it, fantastic, it's wonderful. So I just don't know if he ever really, because I looked and he only mentions the Silver Key once, and he doesn't really talk in terms of like, that is my absolute favorite. It's just all of them. He seems to say, I love this story. I love this story. This is great. This is sort of like your best one yet or so. So
he talks about At the Mountains of Madness because that was a story that Lovecraft sent to him in manuscript.
Yeah.
Because at the time, Lovecraft was not getting published. His stories were getting longer and longer. They were harder and harder to fit into a pulp magazine. So he was sending the manuscript around to his friends. He's like, okay, you send this to this guy who sends it to this guy who will send it to Robert E. Howard at Lockbox 313 in Cross Plains. And you can imagine getting several hundred pages in the mail and, read this and then forward it to Clark Ashton Smith or something.
Yeah.
And that happened a couple of times. But yeah, when that first came in, it was from R.H. Barlow in Army envelope, because Barlow was at Fort Benning at the time, I think, in Georgia. His dad was in the Army. So, Howard's like, oh, God, am I drafted? But no, it was just Lovecraft sent you a novel. Read it.
Yeah, I will read this. This is in regards to a letter to the Lovecraft about dreams in the witch house. And he says, as always, I experienced the keenest enjoyment in reading your latest story, The Dreams in the Witch House. Is truly magnificent. From the title, a splendid bit of imagery in itself, to the very last line. I shall doubtless reread it many times, as I have your other splendid stories. So, it's about this, just about what he said about most of the stories that he mentions in his letters. But, it's hard, at this point for us to truly say if Howard ever actually said, this is my absolute favorite of Lovecraft's stories. So
yeah, and you got to remember, this is before either of them had any collections. So the only thing they would have read would have been what was in the pulps, if they got them, or what they got in manuscripts.
Yeah.
And we know that Howard did not get all of the earliest issues of Weird Tales. He just missed a few, which is very understandable because those first few issues of Weird Tales had funky distribution and they were changing the size, and it was very easy to miss a couple issues. So he missed a couple of Lovecraft's early stories, but once he was getting Weird Tales regularly, he didn't miss a one.
Yeah.
He probably didn't start seeing Weird Tales till he was living in Brownwood.
Yeah.
In 1923.
Well, that's when it started being published. But yeah, he
Well,
missed
then
a
he
couple
came home for a while, and then when he went back for college,
yeah.
so yeah, there was a big hunk where he probably couldn't get them.
Yeah, and several of his letters to Clyde Smith and Truett, where he'd say, "Go pick up the latest issue of Weird Tales for me because it's not here at Cross Plains. It's
right.
too racy for Cross Plains." So, but also, I've mentioned that a few of Lovecraft's stories did get reprinted in British horror collections at the time. The Not at Night series, where they also took
Howard too. Yeah.
So he had a chance to read them there and also complimented Howard on that.
He might have had a chance to read them there. The problem with the Not at Night stories is they were buying the stories direct from Weird Tales, so they weren't sending out comp copies. So, Farnsworth Wright would tell you, okay, your story's being republished, but getting a copy of a British anthology in the United States became an effort. There'd be like one bookstore that got in like 20 copies, and they'd have to write to them and hope that, they could get it before they were all sold. So he didn't see all of the Not at Night volumes.
Yeah. Let's move on to our last question then. What do you think it would have happened if Howard and Lovecraft actually met each other in real life?
I don't think it would have gone as well as it did on paper myself.
No.
Like I said, I think, when Howard steps out his front door, this is what he sees. When Lovecraft steps out of his front door, he sees something completely different. And there was a bit of an age difference also. I'm not sure. I'm sure they would have been, they would have had things to talk about because they're both contributing to Weird Tales. So I don't think the conversation would have lagged, but I think the meeting would have been a one-time thing. That's just my impression. I can't even give you reasons why, except for I'm trying to imagine if I'm Robert. I always identify more with Robert E. Howard than I do with Lovecraft. And I just can't imagine Howard continuing to try to impress the man. And I think he did try to impress him for a long time. But toward the end, he was more on his own and he wasn't trying to do that anymore. So I think that if they were to meet, there would have been words.
When you read other people talking about when they met Lovecraft and when they met Robert E. Howard, the thing that you notice is that in both cases, these were guys who, once they got started, they could be very quiet for a while, but once they get started, they tended to dominate the conversation. Not necessarily talking over people, but, Howard would get really into whatever he was talking about, and he'd start going on these long stories and, really getting excited and into a subject. And when Lovecraft was getting into a subject, he'd get excited and start talking fast, and the pitch of his voice would rise. He was called very piping voiced when he got into that state. And you can imagine if both of them met in a close enough setting with other people, like a little party in E. Hoffman Price's apartment in New Orleans, and trying to overtalk each other. And, it would have been like two of the geekiest nerds finally trying to come out of their shell at the same time and maybe butting heads. They'd be great until there was a big argument. And then they would be, I don't want to say they'd be life enemies, but, something would have to give. And I don't know what it would be.
I remember
there were just two personalities like that.
I remember when we one of the Howard Days themes a few years ago was on the correspondence between Lovecraft and Howard. And I can't remember whether it was, I don't know if it was you, Bob, or maybe Rusty, where somebody asked that question. And whoever was said, yeah, I can imagine Howard driving down and picking Lovecraft up in New Orleans and driving back through Texas with Howard getting as wildly exaggerated as he's talking and yelling and explaining everything, and Lovecraft sitting in the next seat just holding on for dear life as the car's going all over the place. So that always struck me as funny, but yeah, I could see that happen. All right, well, let's go ahead and end this. I thought I would read this letter that Lovecraft wrote to E. Hoffman Price on July 5th, 1936. Farnsworth Wright passed this on to me, the REH letter to Farnsworth Wright on the rats, and the rats in the walls, and I couldn't rest easy until I had set the author right. Hence, I dropped REH a line confessing my ignorance. I could not resist adding some incidental praise of his work, echoing remarks previously made in the Erie Well, he replied at length, and the result was a bulky correspondence which throve from that day to this. I value that correspondence as one of the most broadening and sharpening influences in my later years. We were constantly debating sundry historical and philosophical points, and through these arguments, as well as through many passages of sheer description, I gained a much clearer perspective on various phases of history than I would ever have had otherwise. He made the Southwest and its traditions live before my eyes, supplementing his descriptions with generous batches of pictorial matter, all now in my files. And whenever he made a trip to any place of historical or scenic interest, he also sent various pertinent odds and ends, such as rattlesnake rattles, with one set of which he included a page of comments so vivid and so finely phrased that I'd like to publish it someday as a prose poem. Indeed, I'd like to publish all his letters with their inscriptive and historical riches. So, what do you guys think? Was this a very great correspondence that we have so much of to read and look at these days, and how it opens up a door into how each man thought?
This is without a doubt probably Lovecraft's best correspondence, because you get so much of the other side of it, because you can see so much of Howard and his letters, and someone that's not just absorbing what Lovecraft says, but responding to it, interacting with him. And it's the only way we know Robert E. Howard as a man is through these letters. You know, as a person, this is where he comes out of his shell. This is the bulk of his correspondence, and it's fantastic.
Yes, it's quite the treasure trove for Howard scholars for sure. I'm not familiar with how valuable they are to Lovecraft scholars because there's so much Lovecraft correspondence to get through. But for Howard, this is him talking to another writer substantially, and not, not one of his buddies in Brownwood. And we've lost so much of Howard's correspondence that he sent to other people. He had a correspondence with Whitehead. He had a correspondence with E. Hoffman Price. Most of those letters do not exist. None of the Whitehead letters exist. So thank you, Lovecraft, for saving those letters.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for staying with us as long as you have to watch this video. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please hit the like button. And if you want to see more videos on Robert E. Howard and the fellow writers that he knew and talked to, and the people in his life, please subscribe to this channel. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.